Roth conversions can be a valuable tool to use when it comes to tax planning for pre-retirees and retirees to lower their lifetime taxable liability. However, if not executed properly, it can actually have the opposite effect, and you can actually pay more in taxes if you don't have a strategy behind the decision that you make. The video today is a fictional couple who are going to implement the Roth conversion strategy. But in this video, we want to talk through some of the assumptions that we use, the criteria we have in terms of some of the planning, and lastly, go through some of the information using our software that we're able to project out a tax savings over time to determine how much we should be looking at from a year-to-year basis and how this can be a viable strategy in retirement. But first, it's important, again, just to reiterate that this is a fictional case study. While we have helped a number of employees retire, the information, the names here are completely fictional. If we've not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Cieniewicz. I'm a financial planner at Hyperion Financial. The information provided today is strictly educational and should not be taken as investment advice. I want to just first cover what some of these assumptions are that we are using so that you can understand how some of the figures and the numbers come to light. Let's first start with the assumptions that we use. Inflation will rise at an annual 2.51%. The retirement accounts are invested in growth and income funds, and inside the traditional and Roth IRA, we're assuming a 6.99% rate of return. While this isn't necessarily how we would approach how these funds should be invested, the example is used to show a comparison on the tax strategy itself. Our fictional husband, Mr. Harris, lives until age 92, and our fictional spouse, Mrs. Harris, lives until age 95. We also assume that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which is currently set to sunset after the year of 2025, will indeed do so in this example, thus reverting back to the old tax brackets. We assume that these tax brackets will be the ones used up until Mr. Harris and Mrs. Harris's death. As we did discuss in our prior video, we want to make sure that the criteria are laid out that Mr. and Mrs. Harris would be good candidates for Roth conversions. So in order to conduct this analysis to make sure that they are good candidates, let's first meet them. Both Mr. and Mrs. Harris are currently working but are gearing towards retirement very closely. A couple of important figures of note. The first one is that Mr. and Mrs. Harris have a combined $2 million inside of individual retirement accounts, which were rolled over from their 401ks. They're currently split at a 60-40 allocation, 60% in stocks, 40% in fixed income. And they do currently both have Roth IRAs, but the balances in there are minimal. Mrs. Harris also has a health savings account valued at just over $24,000. The only debt that they have is a mortgage, which should be paid off by the time that they are both ready to retire. They do also have 3 adult children, Jack, Jimmy, and Joseph, and those 3 children are currently on their own, and each of them are making a good living. Mr. Harris is turning 65 in just a couple of months, while Mrs. Harris is turning 63 the month after Mr. Harris turned 65. Their current monthly expense is right around $10,000, and while that is the case while they're both working, they don't see that changing when they transition to retirement. Both Mr. and Mrs. Harris are each making $140,000 of gross income. Mr. Harris's pension amount at age 65 is $68,000 per year, while Mrs. Harris's annual pension amount is $63,000 at age 63. Their Social Security income figures are the same. However, Mr. Harris's full retirement age is 66 and 10 months, while Mrs. Harris's is 67. Being that Mr. Harris does plan to retire at age 65 and Mrs. Harris plans to retire at some point at age 63, they have acknowledged that Mrs. Harris would need to find some level of health insurance, being that the company would no longer be providing that health insurance. For reference, we were able to find that COBRA premiums are $1,100 a month for Mrs. Harris. They came to us unsure exactly of what an income plan would look like, which again is what we'll go through today. But specifically, we want to focus on the tax planning of their financial plan. It's also worth noting that both Mr. and Mrs. Harris have longevity on their side. Currently, both of their parents are living on both sides and both are in excellent health. Their risk tolerance would show a moderately aggressive risk tolerance. And they've also stated that they don't plan to necessarily use the IRA withdrawals other than to help supplement income in the early years, being that their pension will be able to provide the income to cover their monthly expenses in the early years. Lastly, they've stated that it is important to them to make sure that they are leaving the proceeds of their estate and their assets to their three children, Jack, Jimmy, and Joseph. They've also stated that they don't necessarily feel the need to help them or plan any gifts to the three boys and their families, being that the three boys and their spouses are in stable financial condition. Now that we've gotten to know the Harrises from their financial background and gotten to get a feel for some of their goals, we now want to make sure that we're focusing on a tax smart strategy. As we discussed in the prior video, we want to make sure again that the criteria are met, that they are good candidates. So let's take a look at some of the things that we should be considering before recommending Roth conversions to the Harrises. The first one is going to be healthcare costs. Again, being that Mr. Harris is going to be age 65 at his retirement, he's able to enroll in Medicare. However, since Mrs. Harris will only be 63, she's in a position where she's going to need to find some level of health insurance prior to reaching the Medicare eligible age. What we were able to discuss with Mr. and Mrs. Harris is if Mrs. Harris would consider retiring at age 63 and a half, she does have enough in her HSA to cover the premiums that would be due if she were to elect in the COBRA coverage upon retirement from First Energy. With the cost being $1,100 per month, roughly, to stay on to the plan, she has enough in her health savings account, and the health savings account can cover those premiums that she could retire at age 63 and a half, have the 18 months of continuous coverage, at which point would take her to age 65, thus getting her onto Medicare. We do recognize that not every couple is going to be in a situation where they could elect for COBRA coverage that would get them to their Medicare eligible age. So as a result, there could be some families out there that would be looking at utilizing plans within the Affordable Care Act and the Healthcare Marketplace Exchange. When that's the case, your income level could allow you to be eligible for subsidies. The Affordable Care Act subsidies, though, are dependent upon your income. So when it comes to this fictional case study, we don't so much have to worry about the planning for their Affordable Care Act subsidies, but of note, for other couples that may not be in this situation, this would be a consideration that we would want to make sure of before utilizing a Roth conversion strategy. It has also been discussed with Fred and Joan that the IRMA thresholds that are in place would need to be considered because of the income that they're going to both be bringing in now and into the future. So when it comes to the surcharges for the Medicare Parts B and D, we want to at least talk them through an understanding of their income having an effect 2 years later when it comes to paying that IRMA surcharge. Of note, though, whether they decide to utilize a Roth conversion strategy or not, the IRMA surcharges are likely to take place. Our job is to do our best to make sure that we minimize what those surcharges are, both now and in the future. The next thing that we discuss with the Harrises are the state taxes that they would potentially be facing. They are Pennsylvania state residents, so they're in a somewhat advantageous position in that Pennsylvania, while they do have a flat state income tax on earned income, on their retirement income, such as Social Security, the First Energy pension, or any IRA distributions, they wouldn't be subject to the state income tax. It is still worth considering, though, that they would have tax on things such as qualified dividends, capital gains, or any interest that they may have. So they're not completely immune from state taxes. But when it comes to the Roth conversion strategy, we can know that the retirement income isn't necessarily subject to state tax, that it would be in maybe potentially other states. So again, this is something that you want to be considering depending on your state of residence. As mentioned in the facts of the case, the living expenses that the Harrises currently have is about $10,000 per month, $6,000 of which would be considered essential expenses or things that must be paid, while $4,000 of that is what we would consider to be discretionary expenses. It's important to note that the Harrises informed us that they do not have any major expenses planned things such as a vacation home or recreational vehicle, but did say that that could change over time in retirement. And that's important for us to understand because while it may not be a goal now, that could change in subsequent years, which could have an effect on a Roth conversion strategy. Lastly, when it comes to Social Security, they don't currently need the income from Social Security, so it's part of our recommendation that they consider delaying. Now, in this example, we're going to show that both delay until age 70, but that isn't necessarily the specific advice that we would be giving. Both spouses wait until age 70. So again, for this case, it's an illustrative case. We're showing that both delay until age 70, but at a minimum, we're not recommending that either Mr. or Mrs. Harris collect Social Security at this point in time or collect early. So let's now show some of the projections that could take place if they quote unquote do nothing with their current strategy and what that would look like using our planning software. What would be helpful is if we go through first if they do nothing inside their current plan versus if they consider a Roth conversion strategy. So we'll start by saying that there is a high probability of success that they will not run out of money in retirement. And they do pass away, assuming that we follow our assumptions with a pretty substantial amount of money. But if we look here in some of the early years, we get a feel for where their income is coming from. And then in their later years, how that income is going to be coming in from their different sources. So at retirement, the pension income is going to provide the majority of their income, and their living expenses are going to be covered by their pension income. You'll notice in the first 6 years, this yellow shaded area, which is the voluntary withdrawals that they're going to take just to help cover some of the discretionary expenses. It's a smaller amount that you're going to see in the very beginning here. It creeps up a little bit as they approach the year 2030, but in no year is it really egregious. What we will notice is there are a couple of years in which we see jumps in income. The first year is going to be in 2030 when we notice that there's going to be a significant amount of Social Security that's paid out. And that is going to be at Fred's age 70, and really is age 71, because he turns 70 in November of 2029. So he'll have a minimal amount of Social Security in 2029, but he'll have his full year, his first full year at age 71 in 2030. Again, you'll notice there's another jump that takes place in the year 2032. And this jump is due to two factors. The first one is that Joan's Social Security, a full year of Social Security, is going to be in play for her because, again, her birthday is in December. As a result, she won't notice a full year of Social Security until age 71. And we'll also notice the required minimum distribution is now going to be at play for Fred. Since he reaches age 73, he's going to now need to start to take this, and that will add to his taxable income. Lastly, the big jump that we'll see is in the year 2036, and that's when Joan's RMD is set to take place. So between both Social Securities, the pension, and both RMDs, you're going to see a pretty significant jump in income compared to where they were when they first retired in 2024 to where they'll be in 2036. Where that becomes important is when we look at their tax liability that they're going to be subjected to. So if we look here, when they first retire, it's going to be almost $13,000 worth of tax that they'll have. Again, let's keep in mind, really, the only income that they're going to be bringing in is that pension income with a minimal amount of IRA withdrawals that they'll be bringing in as well. That'll be happening throughout the first 6 years. And then in the 7th year, in 2030, is when they'll notice their first significant bump up. Again, that'll be Fred's Social Security, a full year of Social Security at age 71. We again notice that bump up in taxes when we look at age 73 for Fred because of the RMD age. But we also have to keep in mind that at age 71 is when Joan will have a full year of Social Security as well. If we move ahead to year 2036, at Joan's age 75 is when her RMD would begin. So we can now see that they have all of their income sources at play in the year 2036. And now what we're looking at is a total taxable liability on an annual basis here of $86,503. If we compare that to where they were in 2024, just 12 years ago, you can see it's gone up by quite a substantial amount. As a result, we want to see, is there a way that instead of seeing these massive jumps in tax year to year, that we can avoid this? The other thing that we'll show is the actual tax bracket that they find themselves in. So in their early years of retirement, they are just over the 22% tax bracket. And again, what we want to keep in mind is that it will become the 25% tax bracket once the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sunsets. But in the early years here, in the first 6 years, they find themselves just over the 22 or the 25% tax bracket. If we look at those jumps in income that we've noticed, the first one being in 2030, they're still going to be pretty fairly entrenched in the 25% tax bracket. But if we move forward to 2032, when Fred starts his RMD and when Joan has her first year of a full Social Security benefit, we notice that they then jump into the 24% tax bracket. If we continue to move forward, we again notice that the big jump is in 2036. And as you can see in the remaining federal marginal tax bracket, there's only under $5,000 left before they then would bump up into the 32/33% tax bracket. If projections continue as they will eventually bump up into that tax bracket starting in the years 2040 and beyond, and they'll stay in that bracket up until their passing. We can see that if we scroll down here, again, based on the projections of where they would be, it's the year 2038 in which they would bump from the 28% bracket to the 33% bracket. So what we notice is in these early years, there's not much tax that's being paid. And this is where we could see a potential opportunity for the Harrises and say, well, what if we consider doing Roth conversions at some point in time in their retirement to see if it could help over the long term? If we go back to the cash flow overview and then decide to do a Roth conversion strategy for the first 8 years of their retirement, what we will see is that they're able then to more or less levelize some of the tax that's being paid. But let's first cover what the cash flow would look like. If you notice from the previous example, we're going to start to see that there is going to be higher income in the first 8 years of their retirement. What ends up happening is, you may notice from the previous example, the RMDs that they're subject to pay is actually going to decrease, because instead of taking all those funds out in the years in which they're required to take RMDs, we instead say, well, let's make voluntary Roth conversions along the way in those first 8 years. So while the RMDs are lowered, we are still paying some level of tax in those early years. If we go to the actual tax projections, what we'll see here is in the total taxes, when we compare the taxable liability that they would have had in the quote unquote do nothing scenario to the Roth conversion scenario, let's cover what this would be. Then in the first 8 years, you're going to see this red shaded area, which will represent the difference in taxes paid. They're going to be paying a higher level of tax in these years because they're making these Roth conversions. And effectively, they're going to notice that in these 8 years, it is a fairly substantial jump to what they would have been paying in the do nothing scenario. However, what we want to keep in mind is we're looking to limit lifetime taxable liability. And with the reduction in taxes that would take place over the remaining lifetime for the Harrises, what we can see is that it is a smoother ride for the rest of their lives. We'll notice after those 8 years of Roth conversions that we see a net decrease in taxes that are being paid. And again, this number continues to rise compared to the base scenario because the required minimum distribution would be lower than the base scenario. What we'll see is if we look at the tax bracket as well, compared to the original plan that we had, where we did cross into the 32/33% tax bracket, we'll notice that we don't actually exceed that limit in this example. Again, we are going to be paying more in tax in those first 8 years, but we're filling up the tax brackets in those first 8 years, which can take us to the 25% tax bracket. In the years 2032 and beyond, we'll notice that we bump up to the 28% tax bracket. But in this scenario, we never then cross into that 33 or 35% tax bracket. So instead of having to pay more in taxes over their lifetime, what we notice is a decrease in the overall taxable liability over the course of their retirement. What we'll also notice is that we're able to recapture some of that tax that was lost, and that can instead grow in a tax-free account such as the Roth IRA. What's important to note is that in this type of scenario, we would be paying taxes up front in those first 8 years, but over the course of their lifetime, what we'll notice is an overall decrease in taxable liability. So as we can see, since the Harrises are able to delay some of the income that they would have from their IRAs, and assuming that there would be the growth that we've discussed in this example, their IRAs would start to really gain in value, but along with that, the required minimum distribution would as well. Thus, they could find themselves in a position in their mid-70s where the income could go up significantly, which at first glance could be a good thing, but understanding that there is a taxable liability that comes as a result. So rather than just letting their traditional IRA balances continue to balloon and thus creating a higher required minimum distribution once they reach the eligible age, we can look at a Roth conversion strategy that can help alleviate some of the RMDs that they would have to pay when it comes time for their eligible age. As we mentioned in the beginning of this video, it's important to note that we have both made assumptions and showed projections for the Harrises. So this is something that, again, can result in significant tax savings and thus a higher net worth at their passing. But we also want to keep in mind that this is a year-by-year planning tool that we're going to look to use, and the projections that we were able to show are subject to change. Another important note to discuss is that while the final numbers can certainly look quite attractive, it's important for the Harrises to understand that there is going to be an increase in the proposed Roth conversion plan compared to their original plan of the taxes in the early years. In the years where the Harrises are first retired in their mid-60s, currently, the plan would show that they would pay a smaller amount of income tax. However, if we utilize this Roth conversion strategy, it would increase the taxable liability that they would have in the early years. It's important to note that we'd recommend this to really alleviate some of the costs down the road, but still, it's something that in the early years they would need to be able to stomach and handle, which not everybody admittedly would want to do. This strategy does require discipline and commitment and an understanding that they're planning to do conversions in the early years, paying more in tax than they would otherwise to alleviate the lifetime taxable liability. For retired employees like the Harrises, we also want to note that if they've done a great job saving the amount of money they have in these traditional IRAs, the goal shouldn't necessarily be to try to convert every single pre-tax dollar to a post-tax dollar. While that's something that is maybe quite lofty or can have benefits to it, it's also important, again, to understand that strategies that go overboard can actually end up costing employees or retirees more than it would otherwise. In this example, we want to show a disciplined approach, but also a realistic approach where we're able to convert some of the dollars in the early years, those gap years that we discuss, to allow for a smoother, more even taxable liability over the course of their retirement, rather than seeing the large swings that we saw in the do nothing example in the early years of their retirement to when they have to start collecting RMDs and collect Social Security. To summarize, a Roth conversion plan that is really best utilized would be one that focuses on balance, one that looks at the traditional and Roth IRAs, not necessarily as an either or strategy, but one that can be utilized together to best minimize the long-term taxable liability over the course of their lifetime, but understanding that, again, this plan is subject to change. If you haven't yet, now would be a great time to consider subscribing for more great content revolving around tax planning and retirement planning for FirstEnergy retirees and retirees in general. My team and I have made other videos focusing on the FirstEnergy pension, and we'll continue to make some of the videos discussing plans such as Social Security election, additional things such as tax planning that First Energy employees can consider, and face some of these challenges that lie ahead for them. Lastly, if you haven't yet, feel free to check out our website, hyperionfp.com, for more great content